Wandering around the desert, that's not my idea of a fun thing to do. But that's exactly what God's people did for 40 years. You see, they had met with God at Mount Sinai for a year where he gave them his commandments. And at that point, they were only about a month's journey away from the promised land. When they got there, they were intimidated by what they saw, and they wouldn't go in. And so God made them wander around until that entire generation had died. Relatively speaking, it was a short distance from Mount Sinai, where Moses got the Ten Commandments, to the Promised Land. But I'm not going to minimize what it must have taken to move a nation of almost 1 million people 200 miles across the desert. You've done traveling before. You load up the car, you load up the kids, and you head out. I mean, we've got the advantage of DVDs and MP3s and Nintendo, all those things that help keep the kids occupied during the travel time. But that's not the way it was with the nation of Israel. And at the beginning of chapter 6, we see that God got a taste of what it's like traveling with children.
And the rabble who were among them had greedy desires. And also the sons of Israel wept again and said, "Who will give us meat to eat? We remember the fish which we used to eat free in Egypt, the cucumbers and the melons and the leeks and the onions and the garlic. But now our appetite is gone. There is nothing at all to look at except this manna."
I'm hungry. I'm thirsty. Are we there yet? In keeping with the practice that they had started from the moment they left Egypt, God's people started complaining again. They had watched God do incredible things time and time again, but here they are whining about some very basic things. After their traveling was over, they arrived at the Promised Land. It was exactly what they had hoped for, all they had dreamed about. They even had physical representations of its fullness. I mean, can you imagine needing 2 guys to carry 1 bunch of grapes? Well, when they got there, the people who went to check it out ahead of time also found out there were other people living there, since it was such a great land. And what they found is that there were large, powerful people and well-fortified cities. They even found giants. They were actually people, descendants of Anak, who were known for their power and for their heights. Regardless of this being a land flowing with milk and honey, the people decided that they couldn't take the land. They weren't going to get into the place that God had for them. And they began to complain again. We should find ourselves a leader. We should go back to Egypt. But these were the very people that remembered the God who had delivered them from their bondage. These were the people that had remembered about the oppression of Pharaoh and God's mighty arm in saving them. These were the people that remembered how God had guided them through the wilderness all those years. Now, before we get too critical of the Israelites, I wonder what you and I would have done if we would have been there with them. Even more so, what have we done when moving forward with God would take us to a place that looked like it was impossible to cross? Well, at the end of the day, the nation of Israel decided not to enter the Promised Land. They were unable to see what God could do because they were clouded by realizing what they could not do. The people's lack of faith would send them away from the Promised Land, back into the desert where they would wander for 40 years until that entire generation died. Along the way, they got into their complaining routine that they were so good at by now. I'm hungry, I'm thirsty, they said. But this time Moses had had enough. He deviated from God's plan and took matters into his own hands. But in doing so, he dishonored God along the way. What was Moses thinking? He should have known better. And because he dishonored God, because he disobeyed him, his penalty is that he would not be able to enter into the Promised Land. As this chapter of the story draws to a close, we find Moses near the end of his days. He reminds the people about the choice that it's before them, the choice of life or of death. From the very beginning, God had invited Israel to be his special people. He had cared for them and provided for them. He had plans for them and a place for them. But they had to be willing to do life according to God's ways. There was a flip side to the life coin that God was making available to them. There was another choice besides the blessings of God.
I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, the blessing and the curse. So choose life in order that you may live, you and your descendants, by loving the Lord your God, by obeying his voice, and by holding fast to him. For this is your life, and the length of your days, that you may live in the land which the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give them.
Are you interested in receiving the blessings of God? Who wouldn't be? Like the Israelites of the Old Testament, God has invited us to be a special people. He's got a plan for us. We can choose life, but it will be on God's terms.